Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today I'm planning to do an artist introduction. So I'm going to introduce you to a band that I've actually been a fan of for a very long time. I think it's been like 4 or 5 years since I started listening to Mastodon. So Mastodon is a progressive sludge alternative metal band that formed in 1999 in Atlanta, US. The band has had a very consistent lineup of Troy Sanders on bass, Brent Hinds on guitar, Bill Kelly here on rhythm guitar, and Brann Dailor on drums. I've always remembered Mastodon as the band who never really had a vocalist. They had a guy named, what was his name? Eric Sainer. Eric Sainer did all of the vocals for the band during 1999 and 2000, but because of some personal issues he had to leave the band, and very quickly the band was back at scratch again, where they didn't have any vocalist who could give them the vocals they needed. But as the band started to create music, as they put out their first record, they proved to everyone that they really didn't need any dedicated vocalist to do the vocals for the band. They could do all the vocals for themselves. During the first 3 studio albums, Brent Hinds, the guitarist, and Troy Sanders, the bassist, did all of the vocals for the band. And during the 4th studio album, Brann Dailor, the drummer, also started to do vocals for the band. So here you have a band where the guitarist, the bassist, and the drummer all contribute with vocals to the band, and it works like clockwork. Troy Sanders blends together these screaming vocals together with more clean vocals, and it's the same with Brent Hinds. He also provides some very screaming, this blend of screaming and clean vocals. Although Brent Hinds, as a little bonus, he actually sounds a lot like Ozzy Osbourne. Brann Dailor contributes with plain, clean vocals, but he as well sounds very good and contributes a lot of value and variety with his voice. All of their voices are very different and distinct, but despite of that, they manage to create this very nice coalition of voices. It sounds like a great harmony, really. So this adds another level of variety to the music that they're creating on several of their albums, while at the same time managing to keep it very cohesive and orderly. If I was to compare Mastodon's music to any other bands, I would say that their earlier albums sounds a bit like Baroness or Red Fang. They had this very heavy, sludgy metal sound to them. But the thing about Mastodon is that they combine all of these different genres. They also sound very progressive and experimental. So on that side, I would almost compare them to acts like the Mars Volta, Gojira, or even Dream Theater. On another side, they also create this very slow-paced, psychedelic, fuss-filled music, which almost reminds me a bit of bands like Sleep or Truck Fighters. And on top of that again, in addition to creating very sludgy, heavy metal, progressive, and psychedelic music, they also have this sweet spot for creating acoustic music. Mastodon has this incredible ability as a band to take many different parts from different genres, mixing it together, and then creating some really authentic and classical albums. Now, let's get into the albums, okay? So the first album they came out with was Remission. It came out in 2002 through, I forgot the record label, through Relapse Records. And to this date, Remission is actually one of the most heaviest albums that you will find in the Mastodon discography. There is basically no clean vocals on any of the songs. It's full-on screaming and growling throughout the whole record. And that gives this album a very harsh, powerful, and in-your-face attitude or sound. The crunchy and fuzzy guitars play a leading role on this record. They're very heavy, as I've told you before, but they're used in a way that brings forth these very catchy and engaging melodies. It's a very riff-based record that brings together these Black Sabbath-ish riffs together with some more technical time signatures and progressions. In certain tracks, it almost seems like the drums and the guitars are competing against each other to take the lead. So Brann Dailor, the drummer, has been celebrated so many times for his very authentic and personal way of playing the drums. He is basically all over the place. He has this incredible speed. When he moves across the drums, he moves with an incredible velocity, and at the same time he mixes this up with a very technical skill. Whenever you hear a drum fill, Brann Dailor is basically exaggerating it to the limit. As a result, the drums become very dynamic, very energetic. They're basically all over the place, and I really dig that. I really like it. Another part of this album that kind of adds another dimension to the mood and the sound is the background story. So this whole album is actually dedicated to the death of Brann Dailor, the drummer's sister, who tragically committed suicide when she was 14 years old. I haven't really looked that much more into the story, the background story, or what happened, but it just makes the whole record a lot more tragic, sad, and you can clearly hear that his aggression, his sadness is kind of manifested into the drums here. In 2004, Mastodon released the one and only Leviathan. It's an epic concept album that is inspired by the novel written by Herman Melville called Moby Dick. It's a book written, I think it was written back in 1851, and it tells the story of this very harsh and violent sea voyage. The story tells us about this obsessed and close to crazy captain who is called Ahab. The reason why this captain is so crazy and obsessed is because on a prior sea voyage, this giant sperm whale called Moby Dick literally bit off one of his legs. And the story continues with Ahab gathering a crew and actually going out on this sea voyage to kill Moby Dick and actually seeking revenge on the whale. Just the idea of converting this epic story into a metal album is just so interesting in itself. And guess what? Mastodon managed to execute this idea in such an epic way. The album is amazing, and it definitely pays homage to the literary piece. I mean, I'm literally an example of that. I remember back in 2012, I actually picked up the book Moby Dick because I had listened to this album and I found the story so interesting that I actually wanted to read the book as well. To be honest, I don't remember that much of the book, but this is just an example of how influential this album was on me, at least. All the different songs on Leviathan take into account the different events and characters from the book, which adds a whole new level of depth to the album. So you're not just listening to a bunch of meaningless songs. Each and every single one of the songs on the album have an innate story and meaning to them, which is really, really awesome. If I was to compare Leviathan with Remission, I would absolutely say that Leviathan is the more ambitious project from Mastodon, solely because this was a concept album. On Leviathan, they also started to implement more clean vocals, which was very new to them, and in my ears, it made them just sound a whole lot more mature as a band. If you listen closely, you can also hear that they crafted more clearer and complex melodies on Leviathan. It almost sounds like they became a lot more comfortable and they started to spread their wings a little bit as a band when they started to create this second project. Now, in 2006, their third studio release was out. It was called Blood Mountain. By this time, it almost seemed like they had fallen in love with this idea of creating concept albums, because Blood Mountain, just like Leviathan, was also a concept album. And the story that is told on this album is just as epic as the one on Leviathan. It tells the story of a man who wants to climb Blood Mountain, hence the name of the album. So he climbs up Blood Mountain, and the reason why he wants to climb it is because there is this crystal skull which is hidden somewhere on the top of the mountain. According to the band members, this is a very sacred and ancient artifact that has the power to transcend you into the next evolutionary step of mankind. It's a crazy and trippy concept, but I just love it. Each and every song on the album reflect the journey of the man who is climbing the mountain. He has to hide from Sasquatches, birchmen, he's facing these flesh-eating birds, he faces hyperthermia, hunger, and he even meets these hallucinatory creatures along the way. It's a really lofty, epic, and even brutal story that I highly suggest that you look into for yourself. So yeah, check out the lyrics if you want to. In comparison to Mastodon's earlier albums, I think Blood Mountain stands out as the most psychedelic one. Listen to tracks like Pendulous Skin, Blade Catcher, Sleeping Giant, and the first part of This Mortal Soil. Listen to those tracks and you'll know exactly what I mean. Again, this is another record with an out-of-this-world touch of cohesiveness and creativity. Each and every time I put this record on, there's another little piece of gold that I dig out. Every time I chip away at this album, I find something new, I find something interesting. It's an incredibly well-crafted album. And so, after 3 amazing albums, you would think that Mastodon would create a shitty record, but no. Crack The Skye was their 4th release, and this was actually the first record that I bought and listened to myself. I think I bought it back in 2011 or 12, and I was a bit skeptical to the record during the first few listens, but as I listened more and more, I started to realize how majestic, just how influential this band really is. Not just to me, but to so many other artists as well. Crack The Skye is just like another pearl on the necklace of good albums that Mastodon has released during their whole career. It is yet another concept album, but that probably doesn't come as a surprise now. The concept revolves around astral traveling and projection, spiritualism, the last Russian Tsar, believe it or not, and the famous historical figure Rasputin. I really haven't put that much attention into the story because the album is just a masterpiece sonically in itself, but if you want to look more into the story, I can link you to an interview where one of the band members actually talks about the background story more in depth, so you can go to the description if you want to check that out. The first things that come to my mind when thinking about this album are the just riveting and mesmerizing licks that Brent Hinds play on the guitar. Just listen to the track Quintessence, for example. It kind of puts you in this otherworldly, psychedelic mood. I would honestly say that Crack The Skye is one of the less heavier albums compared to all of their other previous albums. And the reason why I think they wanted to make this album a lot less heavier is because they wanted it to sound a bit more epic and lofty. And for that to happen, they created melodies that could kind of speak for themselves. I bet that if you took away all the vocals from Crack The Skye and simply listened to the album as a musical or instrumental piece, you would still think of it as a musical dreamscape that just takes you away to a whole other world. It really reminds me of some classical progressive bands or albums, such as Animals by Pink Floyd, or In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. Some of the songs on these albums are kind of divided into different parts. They go completely out of the norm of the classical song structures that you find in more popular music. And there's a lot of similarities between Animals and In the Court of the Crimson King and some other tracks on Crack The Skye. So it really has that similarity to some very classical progressive albums. And it really makes me think of this album as well as a masterpiece, as a progressive masterpiece of modern progressive metal. Now, if we talk about the instruments that are used on this album, there's a very basic lineup of guitars, drums, bass, you know, like classical rock, metal lineup of instruments, but you also have like the synthesizer. They started to use a lot more synthesizers on Crack The Skye, and they also Brent Hinds also started using a banjo that you can hear on the start of the track Divinations, which also adds another level of instrumental variety to the track, which is cool. Commercially, at that time when they released this record, they were really just skyrocketing out there with the reputation of being a very, very good metal band. Everyone started to pay attention to Mastodon when they released this album because it was such a classic. It was such a masterpiece. And as I've told you before, this is one of the few golden nuggets when it comes to the new modern progressive rock genre. So this really took their reputation as a band to a whole new level. I remember the first time I saw them live here in Norway, they were actually touring with Metallica. They've come really far as a band, to say the least. In 2011, they released their the fifth studio album, The Hunter. This was actually the first non-concept album that they had released ever since Remission, so they really wanted to change things up a little bit with The Hunter. Their sound became a lot less experimental and progressive, and they started leaning more towards that generic mainstream metal sound, like Metallica, for example. Although they had taken a complete U-turn when it came to their sound, they really sounded very good. It was like they had taken the best of their experimental and technical side and put it into a more conformed and compact package. Their progressive side, their progressive edge, was still there. But that is the thing, it was more like an edge and not a fully incorporated sound like you can hear on Crack The Skye. And although they changed a lot sonically, I have to say it again, they sounded very, very good. They managed to create this very catchy, atmospheric, mesmerizing, psychedelic sound. They still managed to create that, and it made a lasting impression on me. I have to be honest and say that. This album provides a series of very epic, rousing arena rock songs like Stargasm, Creature Lives, and The Sparrow, while at the same time they also give you some very catchy, riff-based and more centered songs like Curl of the Burl, Blasteroid, and Bedazzled Fingernails. I would personally recommend this album to anyone who's trying to get into modern metal, because it's very accessible. It's a lot less technical and a lot less heavier compared to some of their older music, and I think there's a lot of people that would probably find it a bit harder to get into that. But hey, we all have different tastes and preferences, so I don't know. At the end of the day, I think The Hunter was a very brave release from Mastodon, because although they had created this very, very stable position as the pinnacle of modern progressive metal, they actually chose to go their own way. They chose to take a U-turn and just do whatever they wanted to do. I remember watching one of the interviews with the guitarist Brent Hines, and he put it in a very, very good way. He said that he liked to impress other people with his music, but it was also very important to him to impress himself. So if he would have put out music where he only tried to impress others, that wouldn't be as good, you know. And this mentality, I think this mentality is something that manifests in the music, and that is essentially what makes Mastodon's music great. They wanted to create something that was amazing and awesome for themselves, first of all, and then of course for other people as well. And now we've finally arrived at the last studio album that they have produced and released to this date, which is called Once More Around the Sun. It is not a concept album, it is not as technical and progressive as some of their earlier works. It basically follows up on the sound that they put out on The Hunter. What surprised me so much about this record is just how bad it is. It is insane how much Mastodon plummeted when they gave out this album. It is not tied together in a cohesive way. It sounds like Mastodon is trying to create a sound that is even more accessible and even more relatable to the mainstream metal scene. And there's really nothing wrong in the fact that they wanted to make their sound a bit more accessible and mainstream. But the thing that really caught my attention when I first started listening to Mastodon was that they kind of challenged me in a way. They were always introducing me to some new sounds that I had never heard before. I mean, listen to the track, opening track on The Hunter, for example, which is called Black Tongue. The lead guitar has this very striking melody. The drums are trying to hastily follow the lead guitar, while at the same time creating these very impressive fills in the middle of all of this. The whole mood of the song goes from aggression to sadness and then to triumph at the end of the song when we hear this very majestic guitar solo. It's a thrill from start to finish. It's everything that you want from an opening track. It really sets the standard for the rest of the record, The Hunter, right? Now, compare that to the opening track on Once More Around the Sun. Thread Lightly is the name of the track, and you can clearly hear that the drums and the guitars are kind of held back in the background so that the vocals can kind of take the steering of the song. The fact that the drums and the guitars are kind of held back, their potential is not there, and they're really not interconnected with the vocals, it all just makes it sound very flat, very boring. On many of the tracks on The Hunter, the guitars, the drums, even the vocals are kind of competing against each other, as I mentioned before, and they're kind of working together to bring forth the best in each other. But that didn't happen on Once Around the Sun. It sounded like a bad attempt of trying to make The Hunter 2.0. This album was just so disappointing. It was nothing like what I expected. The songs are not cohesive. It doesn't sound like the album is properly put together. It sounds unfinished. I don't know. There's a lot of people who seem to like this album, and it incredibly got some really positive critics and reception, which I don't understand. But hey, I guess there's a lot of people that are into this new, more mainstream sound of Mastodon, but I don't know. I just hated it. I hated it. I didn't like it the first few listens. I listened to it several times after that as well, and I got more and more and more bored and angry that they actually made this record. It's just horrible. I mean, listen to the record one time or a couple of times and you basically heard everything. There's nothing more to take there. Anyways, we're kind of ending this video on a bit of a sour note, but that was it. That was the whole discography on Mastodon. It is a great band. It is one of the most influential bands that I've ever stumbled across. They've created with some amazing artists as well. They've collaborated with Joshua Homme from Queens of the Stone Age. They've collaborated with Cedric Bixler-Zavala from the Mars Volta, Scott Kelly from Neurosis, Neil Fallon from Clutch. They've basically created a big network of people, of really influential people in the music industry. I remember also watching an interview of Brent Hines where he talked about he told the story about him and Dave Grohl and how they had this chugging challenge. They were basically drinking, competing around that, which is hilarious. I also want to put in a side note here. Mastodon, I've been watching them live I think 3 times. And they're not a good live band. So if you ever go to a Mastodon live concert, they're not as good as you might think they are. Because they're really striving a lot to make the vocals sound good, but they're not singing that much on key. They're struggling a lot with their vocals. I mean, instrumentally they sound amazing, but vocally they're very, very disappointing live. So they're not a good live band. Go ahead and listen to their older albums. They sound amazing on the studio albums. So yeah, just so you know. So that is it. Have you ever heard about Mastodon before, or what do you think about their music in the first place? Please leave me a comment and let me know in the comments below, alright? And for you guys who are new to Mastodon and want to listen more to the band, I've actually created a public playlist on my Spotify account. So if you search up Lielikesmusic on Spotify, you can find my profile and you will find a very unique playlist where I put in a lot of the most essential Mastodon tracks. So that is hopefully something that will make it easier for you to like Mastodon and their albums, alright? Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you liked this video and this artist introduction. If you want to check out more of my stuff, if you like my video, then please click the subscribe button, and I hope to see you later. Stay tuned. Bye.